Welcome to the Landlady Boss podcast, where Rachel and Marie, not only sisters, but also seasoned real estate investors, help women and real estate investors navigate the tricky and somewhat stressful world of property management. Welcome to episode 19 of the Landlady Boss podcast. I'm here with my co-host and sister, Rachel. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Marie. How are you?
Good. I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. Really well.
Good. It's always fun to get together every week just to even visit and be together, but to also talk things real estate and rental properties, because this is kind of what we do. We eat and breathe this. So it's always enjoyable to be together to do this.
Yeah. Right now, I feel like I have a greater surge of people applying for my rentals and wanting to see my listings. So it's kind of a moment where everybody's looking and shopping. So it's a good moment to be a realtor and a property manager.
Yes, I think that's the interest rates dropping has helped that. And also it's just that time of year. People are scurrying. They're trying to get into housing before the cold weather hits, at least where I rent and you rent properties. So the weather has a lot to do with it. It's still nice and people are looking for those rentals and places to go for the next season. So that's fantastic, but that means you're very busy. So we appreciate you coming and listening and taking time out of your busy schedule. And today we're talking about a really important topic. They're all important, but this one is important too. It's references. And should you do them? Why should you do them? Or if you even know to do them. So hopefully some of the things that you hear today will help you with your rentals to manage them even better. So Rachel, let's get started here. Should you do reference background checks? Should you check your references?
Well, I have always been very, very surprised when I have a horrible tenant and I go to evict them and nobody calls. And in fact, on one of them, I knew where they were moving to. I mean, you need to send them their deposit if they get any, and they have a new rental and nobody called me, which means they just inherited my nightmare tenant.
Oh my gosh, isn't that the truth though? Often I don't get called for how many tenants and people move out and you have a high volume. You think that you would get inundated with reference checks, but it's very rare that I actually get a phone call. So you're so right. That means the other landlords are assuming the bad tenants without even checking. So absolutely you should do background and reference check. You should check references and call and make sure that you're checking on those tenants and their history, because if not, how are you going to find out?
Even more important to me, a low credit score. I would prefer to have a tenant that checks out. Their references are glowing from their previous landlord. If they were a great tenant, I don't care that the rest of their life is maybe not so ideal financially. If they're paying rent and are clean, that's what I'm looking for. So that weighs heavily for me on the side of renting to them.
Right, and there's a few reasons I think that we, check the references. One is just verifying that the information they're giving us is accurate, right? Correct. I mean, you're verifying they are who they say they are. You're verifying that the address that they used to live at is correct, that, just the information that they have given you is as correct as you can verify. So just double checking. Right, to make sure it's accurate. That's huge.
Just that alone.
That alone.
Right there. Yeah, so I do call in person. I call, my managers do, or I do. We call their housing references and we call their job references. I want to make sure that they are making the money that they say they're making, and also that they were a good tenant before. That's a big track record that I want to check up on.
Right, and those are so important to find out. And we have, in part of our courses, we go into depth about this, how to screen the applicant, what platforms we use, and what questions, all these things. So today we're just skimming over the surface. We're talking about maybe some of the important questions to ask and what questions not to ask. But if you're definitely wanting a more in-depth, deep dive into the references and background checks and how to screen your applicants, please check out on landladyboss.com our courses about it, because that's going to be a lot more involved. But this is going to be kind of just scratching the surface, because it is a very expansive topic that is super important, because I talk to different landlords or people, and they'll say, oh, I kept having to kick people out and turn the place over, and I stopped painting and keeping it up because people would tear it up, and then I'd get the next person in, and then they would tear it up, and I had the conversation last week with someone, and they said, so I just stopped fixing things, and because everyone's just going to tear it up anyways. And I just said, well, did you screen any of your applicants? I mean,
because if they
not
damaged,
that bad things don't happen. Yeah, but I mean,
if they damage somebody else, they're going to damage yours. And if they were a good tenant to somebody else, it's really rare that they just suddenly turn into a really bad, messy tenant, that does a lot of damage.
Right. And of course, things happen, but I just left that conversation puzzled, going, okay, he just keeps doing the same thing with the same result. That's the
definition of insanity.
Exactly. And so making sure you're screening them is going to hopefully prevent any massive surprises like that. And I just felt sorry for the man, but he's kind of creating his own problems because he's refusing to do a little due diligence up front, mm-hmm. which saves so much headache in the long run. So you're not only verifying the information's accurate, you're just assessing the tenant behavior. You're going to be asking specific questions we're going to get to towards the end, and you're going to be getting a feel. You're just trying to create a picture. Okay, what kind of tenant this person is? Do they have a lot of noise complaints? Are they just difficult to get along with? Are they messy? Obviously some of these things you can't just come out and ask, but you're trying to paint a picture of what kind of person this tenant is before you give them the keys and access to your pride and joy that you have worked so hard on and say, have at it. You want to make sure that you have done all that you can. So if there are problems, you don't look back and go, okay, well, why didn't I? Regret is painful when you could have regret, but if you have regret because you dropped the ball and you didn't take that little extra time, like you said, you call the business references and the housing references just mm-hmm. to paint that picture, and that's so important.
Yeah, in fact, these questions that I ask, they've been evolving over the years. Often, I didn't ask enough questions or the right questions, and so over time, mm-hmm. I believe that we've created the right questions that get to what we want to find out. And much like interviewing staff, you can interview and ask all sorts of questions, but if you're not asking the right questions, you're hiring somebody that you didn't actually get to know in the correct way. So this is how you get to know the tenant. So if you want to hire them, if you want to get them as your tenant. So
right.
The first question, of course, is one that everyone asks. It's, have they ever been late on their payments? And the answer to this, even if they say yes, you follow up with, okay, how frequently in the last year? And if it's twice or once, and they paid within the same month, they didn't keep it going longer, then I don't count that as a terrible thing. They ended up paying $50 more in rent that month. That's not the worst. What's bad is if you have to go after them and keep sending out emails and to collect. That's taking your time. Them paying on the 10th versus the 5th and paying $50 more isn't the end of the world to me. But if they did it 8 times, well, that's another issue, right?
That's showing a habit there that mm-hmm. they continued to do. So that's important to verify. Yeah, and you're seeing potential risks. I mean, everything with the checking references, you're just seeing how risky is renting to this applicant.
And
so you have to evaluate that.
One of the people that I ended up actually giving a lease to, even though they had been late a bunch of times, when I asked them about that, because after I get my answers, I go back and allow them to have their say, because sometimes there are really bad landlords. So I like to just make sure I get both sides. But the person, so as long as the complaints, I feel like could be slanted one way, right? But the late on payments, they said, well, actually, we get paid on the 7th of every month. And so our rent's due on the 5th. We struggled so much to be able to pay a month in advance after we paid all of our deposits and get everything there. We really can't afford it, but we pay on the 7th. And so I made a deal with them that they would never be late, but I made it due on the 8th. And I just changed their contract to make their rent due on a different day. And they've never been late for me. So it was just an interesting accommodation. That one little tweak on 3 days for me ended up fixing it for both of us. And I got a really good clean tenant that was on time. So that was an interesting scenario.
That's so great because, yeah, going back and checking in with the information. I mean, sometimes, yeah, you get information. I had an applicant a couple months ago that there was a noise complaint or at his job. You know, he had like a record, something written up about him. And I was like, well, if I had just taken that and looked at his record and said, oh my gosh, there's a noise complaint against him, you know, because it's a duplex. Obviously, you don't want someone that has, you know, habitual problems with loud noises. But then I talked to him. He was actually a nurse at a psychiatric ward. And so there was an altercation, you know, with a patient that was very violent. And so the lowest, and the patient had pressed charges, the lowest kind of charge that they could do was a noise complaint against the nurse. So, I mean, so take it for what it is, but I hadn't even considered like, oh, it could be something an angry, irate, out of their mind, violent patient that they're trying to, you know, help, whatever. So you just never know. So I do like that. Or sometimes, as you were saying, with, you know, credit scores or different things, sometimes there's a divorce or a death in the family, proceedings. Or, you know, yes, bankruptcy, that really affect
on medical bills. Yeah, something. Yeah.
So I think it's worth. Yes, if everything else is looking great and the references are just checking out, you know, having that conversation, I think, is important to let them have their piece to say they're part of it.
Right. The next question, do they owe any money currently? That gets after the part where they left and there's still a huge amount of damage sitting there. That will let you know that they have $4,000 they still owe. Which when we do ask, did they get their deposit back? The answer is no. That doesn't tell you the extent. But do they owe any money currently tells you the extent of damage that they did, which would tell you, okay, it wasn't something that I really, you know, want. It's not a tenant I really want. If they were willing to leave and they have rent unpaid and they have, you know, damage, etc. So that gets at that
thousands
question.
of dollars in damage. Yeah, exactly. That gives you kind of an idea, the scope.
The scope. Yep.
That's good.
Are they eligible to move? Are they breaking contract? I had one person, when I asked this, they said, I actually didn't know they were leaving. They have a year contract with me. And
oh my goodness.
Yeah, so are they eligible to move? Lets me know if they're going to just skip out on me too. You know, are they willing to do the terms of their contract and follow them? This question's a good one.
Exactly, because they'll just do the same to you possibly and leave you in the lurch if they're breaking their lease.
Right.
The next one is, have you had any complaints from the neighbors?
Or police.
or police involvement. That one is an important one because I can't tell you how many times I've had people call and ask me references and they've never asked that question. And I even had a very criminally active tenant and they were trying to get a new place, which is always kind of tricky because if it's a bad tenant, you kind of want them gone.
Yes.
But you also want to be upfront.
Yes.
But they never asked anything about, you know, any complaints. Now, I couldn't disclose his criminal, you know, convictions and things like that. But that would have right there, because there had been noise complaints and there had been police called, but they didn't ask me that.
Nobody does. That's the question I think that gets at, they can pay on time, they can be clean, but they could also be completely, you know, disrupting the entire community with who they are, and they're yelling and they're fighting with their wife and so or spouse, you know. And so this is the question that gets at that is, are they a good neighbor? Because you want to know.
Right. And they paid every month and it was very clean and they took great care of the yard, but they fought a lot. And they would like to call me and like pull me into arguments. And I'm like, I am not your therapist. I do not need to be in this, you know. So that's a great question.
The next one is because I would have people who would bring in animals after they sign a contract, if even it's a no pet like an apartment, and they might bring in an animal, or they might be smoking inside the apartment. And so some of these questions won't get at that until you say, have they ever broken contract with you? Brought in animals that weren't allowed, smoked when they weren't supposed to. Like I give them ideas of how they could break contract. And this brings up all sorts of things that I might not have thought of, which is they left without telling me. I mean, I did fill it, so it's fine, but they did break contract. Or they brought in a dog when they weren't supposed to. This tells me to look for an animal for this person who says they don't have an animal, or that they do smoke when they say they don't. This is the question for that. Yeah.
Right. Because there's all sorts of reasons that they could be breaking the lease and, or did they, oh yeah, they were fine, but they did allow another family to move in with them.
Right.
That I didn't know about. I mean,
right.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So
this one will get answers that nothing
you...
else will. Yeah. This gets at the contract, right?
Yeah. And then the next one we ask is, were they a clean tenant? And you can get a whole slew of answers for that one.
Yes.
They might be like, well, yeah, or yeah, what you want to hear is, yes, they kept it so clean. Every time we did inspections, everything looked amazing, and they left it in great condition. Okay.
I often hear, I wasn't in there when they were living there, so I don't know, but when they left, it was spotless. Like it will pull out the condition of the apartment as they were leaving that, I want to know too. So, and that also gets on if they were cluttery in the common areas. Did they store a whole bunch of strollers and a shopping cart on the porch? Like, were they cluttery? And so were they clean tenants? If they don't know about the inside, they might mention the outside, and they say, well, they did have a lot of extra cars on cinder blocks. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's good to know, but were they clean tenants? And you just let them go with that one.
Yep. That is true. The art of the pause or the silence, whatever that is, and just waiting and letting them fill that silence. And then you'll learn all sorts of information.
Yep. Let them talk. Let them talk.
Yeah. And the next one kind of goes back to one of the earlier ones that you said, but if they've already moved out, are they getting their full deposit back? That's a good question, because if they're not, then that leads to, oh, okay, why?
Right.
Right, because there's all sorts of reasons why. So that opens up.
Yeah.
If the earlier questions haven't revealed something, this will then reveal something else. So I mean, all of these are created to come at the issues from different angles to hopefully create a clear picture of what kind of tenant this person would be.
Right, and they're just, I think 8 short questions. The last one I added later on. I didn't ask this before, but it's, would you renew with them if they wanted to stay? And the reason why this is a really, really important question is because all the other questions, they can be a tenant that's clean and pay on time, and a tenant that gets along with their neighbors, but they could be a very annoying tenant. And this one is the person I asked this to, a landlady said, well, actually, I wouldn't. And I'm like, oh, why? Because all of the other questions were answered perfectly. And I was going to say, okay, I've got myself a new tenant. And she said, oh, well, it's because they would call me like every other day or at least once a week about something they didn't like. There's a problem with this or that. And they're just so picky, nitpicky that, yes, that they wanted to not actually deal with this tenant anymore, even though they obeyed all the rules. And so this question, would you renew with them if they wanted to stay, will tell you more about them as a tenant than some of the other questions even.
Right. And you can also, if they hesitate or go, well, I guess, I mean, you can infer a lot out of that response, the hesitation. Maybe proceed with caution.
Yeah.
But that's a great question, and you never get asked that. You get asked all the other things, how long did they stay there? Were they paying on time?
Yeah.
Maybe you get asked, Did they get their deposit? I mean, maybe, but
Right.
I had 2 different landlords call me checking for references on 2 different tenants, and it was amazing to me how different. One person called and said, were they ever late on rent? And I said, no, they paid every month. And he said, okay, thanks. In the story. And then I had another person call, and I mean, she had a lot of questions, kind of like these, very in-depth, asking like, did they ever break the lease? Any complaints? Were the police ever called? I mean, just very specific questions like we do. And what a world of difference that conversation was. I mean, it was the tenant had actually been a police officer in his family. Like, I mean, I had no complaints and they were excellent tenants, but I just left that phone call going, wow, that was night and day between 2 different references. And can they say check? I made the call, I checked the references.
Right.
Yes, but it's a totally different picture that you're getting when you really ask some very specific questions. And I love that last one. Would you renew with them again? Because like you're saying, even if everything else looked great, if there's that hesitation, if there's they called me every night at 10 p.m. or they just were difficult, or just, like you complaining. I mean, you just proceed with caution. You have to decide if that's something you really want to deal with or not.
Right. Yeah, and it'll come out. So those are awesome questions, and I think you need to always check the references. I think the other part of this that we haven't really talked about is that when you find out enough about the references, you now can go back and you've created this like portfolio of the tenant that you now are accepting them with the good and bad. You're going into it with your eyes wide open, and you can create those accommodations for the things that perhaps they were weak on, if you're willing to take them. But now you can make those decisions, and I just don't think that other people they get what they're stuck with. They're just excited someone applied. Yeah. Anyway.
Mm-hmm. So
yeah.
even if you go through all those questions and there's something that maybe makes you a little hesitant, you can then decide, like you're saying, with your eyes wide open and say, okay, if I do want to proceed with this, then I'm going to need to either put something in the lease to cover something you're concerned about. But if you are running to them, like you're saying, at least it's on your terms and like you understand and you can make it very clear to them. So that's a decision you at least get to make versus
Just
2
blind.
months in going, I had no idea. Now you're kind of stuck.
And likewise, when people are calling you for references, you need to be careful you're not giving information that isn't asked for, that you're not blacklisting that tenant, that the tenant can't come back at you and say, you were prejudiced against me. So you just need to be really careful that the information that you're giving is related to their contract, is related to them as a tenant, not that you didn't like their clothes they wore or the food they made or anything that could be construed as personal, and keep it just really professional in your answers too, that you're answering about things that should be on the record.
Yeah, and I think that brings us to a good point. Really quickly, we should go over what questions you don't want to ask when you're checking references, because you can get in trouble with discrimination. You don't want to ask any questions that are discriminatory, about race, sexual orientation, familial status,
nationality.
religion, nationality, any of these things, because that could come back to bite you, and it's just illegal.
Right.
So you don't want to do that. You can't ask, are you planning on having more children, or do you know if they're planning on having more kids, or how, like, what are their family plans? I mean, you can't really get into those personal decisions in life, or well, what religion are they, or do they tend to do this on these days? Like, you have to be very careful that you aren't asking any of those questions that could be viewed as discriminatory.
And that's why the questions that we have procured, that we've created, stick with getting the information we want to get, but are always definitely on the side of what we can ask. So that's important.
Mhm.
Yeah. So the next.
Yeah, and those questions, like you said, are things that we've developed over years of
Yeah.
doing it. I know they might seem, oh, that's a simple list, but
Yeah.
they're very specific. They're legal. They get to the root of the issue. They create a picture. So, it's taken years to kind of develop those and tweak them. So hopefully they're
Yeah.
big help.
And they're available on the class called How to Find Your Dream Tenant. So that's the class if you want to know where all of this is, the how-to on getting a dream tenant. That's the course that you would purchase. So let's talk about the questions we're going to ask their job references, their employer.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because you already, so the rental references have checked out. Okay, so now you're calling their job, and obviously you want to verify that they make what they said they make. Often on those portals they can upload their payment stubs, so that's helpful. But yeah, verify they're actually employed there.
Mm-hmm.
Verify that their income is what they say it is.
And sometimes if you're in a college town, you'll have people moving and getting a job at the same time. And this means that when you're calling the references, they might have only had the job for 2 or 3 weeks, but you can ask, is this a long-term hire? So even if it's a recent hire and they do have a job, you can inquire the duration of it, which would establish that they have the ability to pay rent for longer amounts of time. So that's also a question you can ask. But anyway, the questions we're going to talk about are they on time and dependable? So this is something you can ask an employer, which also kind of gives you an idea of how they'll be as a tenant, if they're good for their employer.
Yeah, if they're habitually tardy and missing days of work because of whatever reason, it might be a job that's not going to last. So
right. And you need it to last.
That's important. Yes.
Just as much as they do. I ask, are you related to the applicant? Because this is when it pulls out, well, yeah, I'm their mom. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm glad we can establish that they have a job, but then I can also take with a grain of salt some of the things that they're telling me, just to make sure that I'm getting information, but that it's may not be as reliable, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just making sure. But yeah, and you'd verify their wages like we mentioned before. And then the last one you could ask is, if you had a rental, would you rent to this employee?
Right.
And see what their response is.
Yeah.
Who knows? They might be like, well, they're not very clean and they're kind of undependable, and I don't know.
Yeah, I've gotten good questions.
Be able to tell.
Yeah, I've gotten good answers from this one. I've had employers tell me, well, yeah, actually, I even have them babysit for me, or something where it just like shows this level of trust. But usually they'll tell something that will either establish trust or establish distrust. And so that's getting at the trust issue, because really you're tying it back to, they do make enough, how long have they worked there, are these their wages, and then the real question is, if you had an apartment, would you trust them to rent for it? And I've gotten, well, actually they kind of, I'm kind of concerned that they might be having a drug habit. And it's pulled out some interesting things from the employers, which I know that they probably shouldn't be telling stuff, but that's not on me. I'm just collecting information.
Right. You're not responsible for how people answer. If you're asking legal questions, that's on them.
It's on them. But I do appreciate the feedback. Right. But that one's a good one. And that one pulls out a trust thing, because it's really hard to find a question that will get that out of them. But since you are calling about housing and they have applied for housing, it's a fair question to ask their employer. So
exactly. Yeah. So I think if you go through and make sure checking references is a priority, you ask these questions, not that it's going to always end perfectly, but you really eliminated a lot of the trouble ones or problem tenants you may get just by asking these questions if you do nothing else. And then of course we'd recommend you do background checks and make sure that you are, verifying credit scores and all this other stuff. But this is going to be key in screening your tenants and making sure that you have responsible, clean, wonderful tenants, and it's going to make your life easier. Oh my goodness, I can't tell you the difference night and day between good tenants and bad tenants.
Oh my goodness. It's true.
Yes, it's for your sanity too, because it makes all the difference in the world. So taking just that extra, even if it takes a day or two to verify this, to get a hold of these people, to ask these questions, is so worth it. Take the time, do the due diligence, make sure that who you are leasing to is going to be someone that aligns with your expectations and your lease and is willing to abide by those agreements. Otherwise, it's going to be a very difficult relationship.
Right. No, having a great tenant makes all the difference in the world. So we hope you have good luck with your tenants. And from now on, you need to do the reference checks. Other landlords don't, and that's not what makes them a boss. But you're the boss because you do the things that will get you good tenants. And this is one of them.
So right.
Yeah.
If you're enjoying our podcast, please share and subscribe and feel free to leave a 5-star review. We would love that. And we are hoping that we can help other landlady bosses be the best property managers that they can possibly be. And remember, no one is going to manage your property as well as you.
We're excited you found the Landlady Boss podcast, where we encourage, empower, and educate women on their real estate investing journey. For more information and access to our courses, go to landladyboss.com. We will help you to better manage your properties so they don't manage you.